Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. Last week I did some sculpting and I converted these skeleton warriors. I've been thinking about how to paint them and I wanted to pick colors that have a similar feel to the studio turquoise and gold color scheme, but change it in a way to help the armor stand out more. I ended up mixing a custom color for the bone, as well as a dark, muted turquoise. So grab your paints and let's get started. I began by spraying all the models with a gray primer. The spray is bound to miss a few spots, so I like to go in afterwards with a gray paint and touch up any areas that need it. With the gray undercoat dry, I got out my airbrush and sprayed them with white. Normally I would do a zenithal kind of spray all over the models, but for these I'm mostly concerned with the bone. I'll be painting the other areas with opaque paints, so the white layer isn't as important. I want the bone to be really bright to contrast against the other areas, so I went back and sprayed several light layers. I'm going to use 2 mixes for this army, and it'll be a lot easier to mix up a whole bottle of each. That way I only have to mix it once. I want the bones to stand out against the armor. Since the armor is going to be on the yellow side, I want to avoid using a yellowish color for the bone as well. I tested out a few different mixes for the bone, and I liked the way Nuln oil looked when mixed with skeleton horde. The mix I settled on was equal parts Nuln oil, skeleton horde, and contrast medium. I got a small container and poured in the skeleton horde paint, and made a mark with a Sharpie. Then I poured in the Nuln oil, keeping an eye on the waterline compared to the previous mark. When it looked to be about double the height of the last mark, I stopped pouring and made another mark. Then I poured in some contrast medium until it looked about equal to the others. I mixed it up with an old brush, and then poured it into an empty bottle. I mixed the turquoise color from Macragge blue and Caliban green base paints from Citadel. Stegodon scale green is pretty close to this if you don't want to mix anything. The mix I like uses a little bit more blue than it does green, about 3 parts Macragge blue to 2 parts Caliban green. I started off by pouring some blue into the mixing container. Then I added small amounts of green until the mix looked right. I think it's better to mix a color like this, slowly working towards the final color and checking it along the way. After a couple adjustments, the color looked just right, so I poured it into the bottle. I like using some airbrush medium to clean out the last bit of paint from the container. Then I cleaned the top with a paper towel and put the cap on. Make sure to label the bottle so you know what's in it. The marker will rub off over time, so I like to cover it with a piece of clear tape. With those 2 colors mixed, now we can get to painting. I'm starting off with the bone color, an equal parts mix of skeleton horde, Nuln oil, and contrast medium. Paint this just like any other contrast paint. Work on one section at a time, and coat the area with plenty of paint. Then use the brush to soak up any excess paint. You can get a pretty effective highlight by rinsing and drying the brush, and then wipe away some of the paint off the raised edges. I also like to wipe away some of the paint with my finger. It can make an even brighter highlight. I want to have some variety in the regimen, so I diluted the mix with an equal amount of contrast medium. This color is light enough where I don't even need to wipe away the highlights. Just be aware that the shadows won't be as dark, so you may want a second coat in some areas. I ended up diluting the mix in a few different ratios throughout the unit to add variety. I'd like to use this time to thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying the video so far, please don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. If you like what I do here and want to help support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. There are a few perks including early access to videos. We also now have a Discord server, so come join the discussion and share your hobby progress. Next I painted the spears and wooden portions of the shield with black Templar. I'm not worried about the paint getting on any of the armor, since I'll be using opaque paints for the rest of it. I just want to make sure I don't get anything on the bones, since those areas will be time consuming to fix. After the first layer of black Templar dried, I went back with a fine brush and painted a few lines along the spear. The spears don't have much texture for the contrast paint to pick up, and adding a few lines like this looks like wood grain. Then I carefully painted some black Templar in the eye sockets, mouths, and alongside any armor where it meets up against the bones. Next I used my turquoise mix, about 3 parts Macragge blue to 2 parts Caliban green. You could use Stegodon scale green if you don't feel like mixing a color. I painted this on the shields and any cloth areas. Some of the shields will be divided with white, and I avoided painting those spots. After the first coat dried, I painted a second for an even finish. Then I shaded all the turquoise areas with a generous coat of Nuln oil. Next I base coated the white halves of the shields with a very light gray. This is gray number 7 from my custom grayscale, and you can find out how to make your own here. If you don't feel like mixing any colors, Gray Seer from Games Workshop is a pretty close match. With the gray dry, I shaded those areas with a thin coat of Gryph-Charger gray. Since the armor is all going to be a warm yellowish brass color, I wanted to go with more of a cool tone for the white rather than warm, to contrast against the armor. I want to have some more definition between the white areas and the trim, so I painted a thin line of black Templar anywhere that the trim meets up with the white. I'm not going to bother with blacklining the blue sections. I think they're dark enough and it won't make much of a difference. Next I painted all the armor and shield details with Runelord brass. This is one of my favorite colors for painting brass and bronze. Usually I shade it with a red-brown, which gives it a reddish copper hue. I want this to have more of a yellow hue though, and I'll cover that next. I'm going to paint a highlight on the brass before I shade it, and for that I'll be using Stormhost silver. I guess this would be something in between a dry brush and a highlight, maybe more like a precise dry brush. I like to take a fine-tipped brush and gather some paint with it, then wipe some of it off on the palette. It forms the brush into a chisel kind of shape. There's still a lot more paint on the brush compared to a dry brush technique. And then I just kind of drag it along the surface of the model. I'm not too concerned about getting it on all the edges. The shade is going to tone it down a lot in the next step. I'm mostly concerned about being clean and making sure I don't get any silver on the rest of the model. Now it's time to shade the brass, and for that I'll be using Aggaros Dunes Contrast paint. This color has a yellowish tone, and it will also tint the brass to be closer to the color I want. I painted a thin layer over all the brass, allowing it to pool a little in some of the areas for deeper shading, and less in others. I want to add some oxidation to the brass armor, and I began by thinning down some turquoise paint with water. There are a few different specialty paints on the market, but I think regular acrylic paint works just fine. Apply a small amount at a time, like a glaze, and build up layers where you want more depth. The paint will look a lot brighter when you first paint it on, and then it'll darken and dull down as it dries. Next, I painted Iron Hand steel on all the spear tips and the shield handles. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. Then I shaded the steel areas with Agrax Earthshade. A few of the shields have some pieces of parchment, and a couple spears have a wrapping around the end. I base coated those areas with Zandri dust. And then I shaded them with the bone mixture from earlier. After the shade dried, I painted the nails on the parchment with thinned black, and then added a few lines of text. Maybe it's some kind of evil curse, or one of those trendy bone broth recipes. At this stage, the models are basically done. I want to add just a couple highlights here and there. Nothing crazy, just something to help them stand out a little bit more. I added a few scratches on the edges of the spear blades with Stormhost silver. The shields are really a focal point on the models, and I think adding a simple highlight on them will make all the difference. I picked out the edges of any white areas with gray number 8 from my custom grayscale. If you don't feel like mixing this color, you could just use plain white. Then I highlighted the edges of the cloth and the shields with Thunderhawk blue. For a final touch, I want to add some dust to the bottom of their shields, and a really light dry brush of brown will do the trick. Thin down the paint with an equal amount of water, it should be pretty thin, and then wipe almost all the paint off the brush. There should be barely anything on it. Then take the brush and scrub the bottom third of each shield. It makes an effect that's similar to the powdered pigments that a lot of people use, and that's a great method too, but I like this one more. Less messy. I used an old brush to coat the top of each base with a generous layer of wood glue, and then I sprinkled on coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the sand with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a very heavy dry brush of Balor brown, and then a heavy dry brush of Bonewhite. I painted the rocks with black Templar, and then highlighted them with Eshin Gray. I painted the edge of the base with black, and after that dried, I applied a few patches of brown static grass with superglue. I'm really liking the look of these models so far, and I can't wait to get started on the next regiment. I'm leaning towards working on the chariots next, and thinking about what kinds of sculpting to do on them. Do you have any thoughts or ideas for the next models? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting!